Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the Prison Rape Elimination Act, Advocacy and Confinement. I am Rebecca Main. I'm the PREA coordinator with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I am happy to be joined today by Leah Weber, who is the Program and Policy Analyst with the Department of Corrections in the PREA office. Just a few housekeeping issues. If there are any technical problems, Peter is here to assist us, and you can let him know just by typing whatever issue you're having in the chat box. We do encourage questions throughout the presentation. Also, those can be typed in the chat box, and we'll answer them throughout the broadcast as well as at the end of our presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Leah Weber, who will introduce herself and get us started.
Great. Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to not only the exchange we'll have with each other today, but to what we hope grows from this conversation about advocacy and confinement. Correctional staff and advocates alike in Wisconsin have made tremendous efforts in ensuring that inmates who experience sexual abuse and confinement receive support services. It's really our great hope that your participation and continued conversation helps us to build upon that foundation. As Rebecca said, my name is Leah Weber. I am a Program and Policy Analyst with the PREA office for the Department of Corrections. Before joining the department, I was the Director of Services for the Salvation Army of Dane County, and prior to that, I managed a reentry program for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and provided therapy to adolescents and families. So at the root of my work has always been client-centered services, which is a primary reason I'm so happy to connect with you today. Just another few notes before we begin. This webinar was made possible by support from our PREA Reallocation Violence Against Women's Act grant, so thank you to them. I also really want to note that this is not the first PREA-related webinar presented by the Department of Corrections in WCASA. If you search through WCASA's archived webinars, you'll find excellent material presented in 2014. Today, we hope to expand upon that material and describe the ways in which Department of Corrections and sexual assault service providers can streamline services. To do that, we'll be infusing 3 media clips into the presentation. Because of a system limitation, we're unable to stream the audio and video clips through the webinar. Hopefully you receive the links to the recordings in advance of this webinar. When the time comes, we'll prompt you to watch and listen to the recordings in a separate browser. For any of you who have difficulty, we'll certainly add this media to the archived presentation that'll be posted to WCASA's website for your viewing at a later time. And we apologize for any technical inconvenience in advance. I also hope that we keep in mind that while we're focusing on advocacy in Wisconsin facilities, the principles of advocacy and confinement are certainly transferable to any confinement setting. So if there isn't a DOC facility in your county that you're asked to support a halfway house or jail in your community, this material may still be helpful. For some of you, this material may be brand new, and for others, you may be well-versed at providing services inside a facility. For those of you who are dipping your toes into the world of confined survivors, please do ask questions. If we can't answer your question during our time together, please record our contact information at the close of our presentation so that you can follow up. And for those of you who have experience working with an inmate, please share your experience. This forum may not be advantageous for sharing, but please do share with your agency and WCASA. I know that others are anxious to learn from your experiences. And whether this is new material or review, a common thread exists. As an advocate, you already have the skills necessary to serve this population. With a bit of an understanding of PREA, sexual abuse dynamics and confinement, and tips and techniques for serving a confined survivor, you'll be ready to go in no time. For clarity's sake, I predict that we may toggle between inmate and offender, victim and survivor, and assault and abuse. While advocates traditionally say sexual assault, the PREA standards reference sexual abuse, and we'll talk about some definitions in a short bit. Finally, I ask you before you begin, ask you rhetorically, why do or should confined survivors matter to us in our communities? For most of us, we very much value that all people have the right to be free from sexual abuse, sexual assault, harassment. As an advocate, you hold a basic belief that no one deserves to be sexually abused. But some don't necessarily hold that same belief. If you scroll to the comment section of an article about someone who has committed a heinous crime, you'll often see equally heinous comments like, "Don't drop the soap," "I hope he gets what he deserves," "Good luck with Bubba." If you're ever in the position of having to justify or explain the rights of those confined, I hope you'll remember that people are confined as punishment, not for punishment. Proponents of PREA often say that no one ever is sentenced to 5 years in prison and 5 sexual assaults. Those confined in the United States cannot be legally punished by being beaten, by being infected with a disease, by being driven mad, or by being raped. An inmate's experience while confined matters to us, the community, their community. We are stakeholders in their confined experience. We have a vested interest in ensuring that their experience is as rehabilitative and not traumatizing as possible. We know that 95 to 98% of inmates will be released to our communities. When commenting on the state of corrections in his country, an Australian journalist, Richard Evans, said, "They will sooner or later be asked to rejoin society. They will do so having been subject to degrading abuse, which is to them a shameful secret, and to a wider society a laughing matter. Fear and shame will drive some to suicide. Many will be unable to form lasting relationships and will enter a downward spiral of increased drug use. Some will be sexually violent themselves. Odds are they will soon be back in prison or dead." While his comment was directed towards a system on another continent, the guts of his sentiment are certainly applicable to the experience of an inmate confined in the United States. It's our belief that working to prevent sexual abuse is the primary solution. But until we reach that goal, I think we can all agree that beginning the healing process as soon as possible produces better outcomes for not only the inmate, but for community safety. Sorry, guys. Learning how to navigate. So what is the scope of the problem? Like sexual abuse in the community, concrete numbers are hard to come by. The Bureau of Justice Statistics collects a host of data related to sexual abuse and confinement and learn that 1 in 10 former adult inmates report being sexually abused while confined. And just as in the community, we must acknowledge and contend with underreporting. We'll talk a bit later about some of the barriers to reporting for confined people a little bit later. In the meantime, know that the rate of reported abuse is the same for youth. These figures equate to about 200,000 adults experiencing sexual abuse each year in the United States. And 31% of those inmates are victimized 3 times or more. Finally, those inmates that are abused report equal rates of sexual abuse by staff and other inmates. But the question is, what exactly is sexual abuse as the federal government defines it? I'm going to explore that in a second, but let's talk quickly about consent. And I say quickly that because most of you are well acquainted with the notion of consent, and so I don't want to belabor the point, but very quickly, only when someone is willing and able to freely agree to be part of an activity have they consented. And consent plays a really interesting role in confinement. There are a host of variables that may make a person incapable of consenting. If they don't agree or are unable to consent because they are asleep, unconscious, drugged, afraid, feeling threatened, or don't understand what's going on, then they have not consented. Because staff members have authority over offenders or inmates can never truly consent to sexual activity with a staff member, even if they appear to agree. It's always against the law for a staff member to engage in sexual activity with an offender. And while it's not a violation of criminal law for inmates to consent to sex or sexual behaviors with another, it's a violation of Wisconsin Administrative Code. Inmates engaged in consensual sexual behavior can be issued a conduct report and subject to discipline. And as far as PREA is concerned, you'll learn in a moment that consensual sexual activity between inmates does not fall under the definition of sexual abuse. So what is sexual abuse? The Prison Rape Elimination Act offers us 2 definitions. The first definition that you see here is between inmates and other inmates. So inmate on inmate sexual abuse. Sexual abuse of an offender by another offender includes any of the following if the victim does not consent, is coerced into such an act by overt or implied threats of violence, or is unable to consent or refuse. So contact between the penis and the vulva or the penis and the anus, including penetration, however slight. Contact between the mouth and the penis, vulva, or anus. Penetration of the anal or genital opening of another person, however slight, by hand, finger, object, or other instrument, and/or any other intentional touching, either directly or through clothing, of the genitalia, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, or the buttocks of another person, excluding contact incident to a physical altercation. And the second definition here sets forth behavior between staff and inmates. So sexual abuse of an offender by a staff member, contractor, or volunteer includes any of the following acts with or without consent of an offender. Contact between the penis and the vulva or the penis and the anus, including penetration, however slight. Contact between the mouth and penis, vulva, or anus. Contact between the mouth and any body part, penetration of the anal or genital opening, however slight, by hand, finger, object, or other instrument. Any other intentional contact, either directly or through clothing, of or with the genitalia, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, or the buttocks, that is unrelated to the official duties, or where a staff member, contractor, or volunteer has the intent to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire. Any attempt, threat, or request to engage in described activities, any display of his or her uncovered genitalia, buttocks, or breasts, and voyeurism. So cumbersome, I realize, wordy, I realize, but I think it's really important for advocates to have a good understanding of what exactly we're talking about when we refer to sexual abuse. I just want to highlight a few differences between the two definitions. The first is the inclusion of the word with. And it should be highlighted above. So we'll just imagine that in that first sentence, with is highlighted in yellow. But it denotes that even if an inmate appears to consent or does offer his or her consent, it is still considered sexual abuse if the behavior is with a staff member. And second, it only takes contact between the mouth and any body part to be considered sexual abuse. If a staff person kisses an inmate or vice versa on the lips or hand or foot, it is sexual abuse. PREA understands that security staff and medical personnel, for instance, may have contact with an inmate's genitalia, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, or buttocks to ensure health and safety. It provides protection for staff so long as that contact is within the confines of their official duties. As you probably noticed, the threshold for staff is much lower when considering much higher, I should say, when considering staff on inmate sexual abuse. In this definition, a staff person, contractor, or volunteer need only have the intent to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire to be considered sexual abuse. Similarly, any attempt, threat, or request to engage in the described activities constitutes sexual abuse. Another item that doesn't appear in the inmate-on-inmate definition of sexual abuse includes any display of a staff person's uncovered genitalia, buttocks, or breast in the presence of offender. And finally, voyeurism. This item is not included in the inmate-on-inmate definition of sexual abuse. And then we have sexual harassment. In addition to sexual abuse, the Prison Rape Elimination Act says that inmates have a right to be free from sexual harassment. Again, there are two definitions. The first is to address inmate-on-inmate behavior, and another is to address staff-on-inmate behavior. I'll let you take a moment to read those. Notice that there is one primary difference. It's the omission of the word unwelcome in the staff-on-inmate definition. If a staff member engages in any of the behaviors listed in the second paragraph, the behavior needs only to be repeated. It doesn't matter if the inmate welcomes the behavior, consents to it, or appears to enjoy the comment or gestures, it is still sexual harassment. And finally, we have retaliation. Retaliation falls under the umbrella of behaviors that inmates have a right to be free from as set forth by PREA. Retaliation is considered to be hurting someone because that person did or said something hurtful to you. That may include threats of or actual harm after a victim reports an incident of sexual abuse or accusing someone of things they haven't done. It may also include the limitation or removal of programming by a staff member after a victim reports an incident of sexual abuse. So now that we're all on the same page with regard to some really important definitions, I just want to work to have a better understanding of some dynamics of sexual abuse and confinement. So first I want to listen to Chino. Chino was incarcerated as a young person in New York. This is one of those media clips that we're hoping that you can refer back to the email you received yesterday from Wakasa and play the audio clip from Just Detention International. Just about 4 minutes long. As you listen, please consider the ways in which Chino might be vulnerable to sexual abuse. What did you hear? Did you notice any ways in which she was more vulnerable to sexual abuse? I heard, if you just want to type perhaps a response in your chat box, the ways in which she might have been vulnerable to sexual abuse, that would be really helpful to us. Yeah, really good. So we're getting feedback that says she was very young. She described being small in stature. Yep, young, smaller than other inmates. It's a new environment for her. She describes being new to the correctional setting. She's a minor in an adult facility. Really good. She describes being isolated, looking to others for protection. So great. So for us, understanding the characteristics that put an offender at higher risk for sexual victimization creates awareness and greatly improves our ability to prevent and detect sexual abuse and sexual harassment. So what are some of the other characteristics that make one inmate more vulnerable than another? Here's a list of characteristics, and while not absolute, Bureau of Justice Statistics has shown that these characteristics make an inmate more vulnerable in a correctional setting. So those who are first-time or young offenders are often inexperienced in custodial settings and with the inmate code of conduct. First-time or very young offenders, as Chino described being, the Department of Corrections has at any given point youthful offenders in our adult system, that is, people who are 17 years old or younger and adjudicated in adult court. They, for now, reside in adult facilities. They're often very vulnerable. As the standards require, Wisconsin Department of Corrections is working to provide them sight and sound separation from adult inmates. Folks who have limited English proficiency, they, again, are rather vulnerable to sexual abuse. Those who don't speak English as their language or have difficulty, may have difficulty understanding their rights, setting boundaries with English-speaking inmates, or reporting danger. And PREA asks that all inmates who have limited English proficiency or disability be provided ways in which they can benefit from our education efforts. So that is an item that we have implemented. Oftentimes, inmates are resource poor. And what does that mean? It means they're lacking financial, physical, or emotional resources. In order to buy items from canteen or feel protected, they may partner with another inmate who can offer them what they need. We call this protective caring. But this relationship doesn't come free of charge. An exchange of goods or services must be made. And so if an inmate is unable to repay a canteen debt, for instance, they may be forced to repay sexually, and sex then becomes currency. Sex trafficking is assuredly taking place in confinement settings. What do we know about sex offenders? Where do they rank in the prison hierarchy? The bottom right, and as such, they're more vulnerable to sexual abuse. But the two greatest indicators of vulnerability are prior sexual victimization, whether in the community or confinement, and the identification of, or even being perceived as being, LGBTQ or gender nonconforming creates vulnerability. PREA includes I into the set of initials, and I stands for intersex. Intersex is a medical condition. It's really just a less common combination of anatomy, hormones, or chromosomes. The vulnerability of those who identify as LGBT or Q is especially apparent with this statistic. More than 1 in 3 gay and bisexual men report being sexually abused while in custody. And a study in California revealed that 59% of transgender women, so women who are assigned male at birth and therefore housed in a male facility, report being sexually abused compared to 4% of their cisgender counterparts. PREA understands that folks who identify as transgender or intersex are especially vulnerable, and so there are additional protections that help to prevent sexual abuse. These inmates are permitted to shower separately, they're given greater consideration during body searches, and they're given greater consideration in housing and programming assignments, meaning their views regarding their own safety are considered, and assignments, youth programming and housing assignments are reviewed more frequently. Rebecca is going to talk shortly about understanding the racial disparity when working in a confinement setting. And we believe it's equally important to understand issues of gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth when working with this population as well. These issues have great ramifications on an inmate's experience while they're confined. And again, in this statistic, we have the qualifier reported. So the question for you is, why don't survivors report in confinement? If you could use your chat box again and share with us reasons survivors or victims in confinement don't report sexual abuse. What are the barriers to reporting? Yep, fear of not being believed, retaliation, huge stigma to reporting or identifying yourself as a victim. The 2 worst labels an inmate can receive while they're confined, aside from sex offender, are victim and snitch, and that's exactly what you're signing up for when you identify yourself as a victim in confinement. So again, stigma. Don't want others to see them as a weak or a victim, unaware of services, threats from other inmates or staff. Really great. Mistrust in the support from the system. Great responses. So we know that nearly 2/3 of offenders who are victimized by others never make a report. There are huge barriers to reporting in confinement, but largely the barriers to reporting are the same that exist in the community. Offenders who are victimized experience embarrassment, guilt, shame, a sense of responsibility, fear of being retaliated against. They don't trust the system sometimes. They may need their partner or the person who abused them for protection. We know that it's joked about in a way that we would never consider joking about sexual abuse in the community. When we trivialize sexual abuse in confinement, we marginalize those survivors. Our cultural conversation about sexual abuse in prison is marked by laughter. If you just Google John Oliver in prison, there's a short compilation of media clips that highlight how prison rape jokes have made their way into things like SpongeBob SquarePants and episodes of Friends and Puss in Boots. So really discourages inmates from reporting when this is the response the community as a whole gives them. Inmates fear being moved to another housing unit, another facility, being removed from programming. And sometimes victims may not know to report because they don't consider themselves victims. They don't recognize the behavior of sexual abuse because they've experienced similar behavior as a child, adolescent, or adult. It is their normal. Or they may have been groomed or subtly manipulated to believe they are compliant or complicit. I just want to show for you another clip that highlights the dynamics of subtle manipulation. If If you could reference again the clips that you received in advance, we'll pause for about 5 minutes while you watch this clip. If you could first fast forward to the 2-minute and 55-second mark in this video, we'll watch until about 7 minutes and 25 seconds. But before you turn the attention to the clip, I just wanted to provide you a little background. The video was produced by TJ Parcell. TJ experienced sexual abuse while confined in Michigan as a youth. He has grown to be one of the biggest advocates of ending sexual abuse in confinement. He is also a filmmaker. He developed this film as a series of education videos for New York State. So if you could just watch, listen to the dynamics expressed, and we'll rejoin in about 5 minutes. Okay, great. I hope that you all had success watching that video. So I think it does a really good job of highlighting the dynamic of subtle manipulation, which of course we see to some extent in the community, but it's in a concentrated form when we're talking about a confinement setting. So I just want to talk now about some other environmental considerations as it relates to a confinement setting. In a shifted light, you know, of course all of these dynamics have the capacity to occur in the community. It's just that they thrive in a different way in this setting. We know that sexual abuse is motivated by the need to control, humiliate, and harm. We've talked about some already about the role of favors, grooming, protective pairing, manipulation, and coercion. All of these dynamics blur boundaries. Consider also that staff have a unique ability to deny privileges, which may serve as leverage. We also know that because of the routine nature of daily life in confinement, an inmate may be in close proximity to their perpetrator, revisit the location of their abuse nearly every day, or hear, see, or smell other reminders of this abuse in a way that doesn't exist in the community. Inmates don't have the ability to circumvent what may be unsafe, whether that's real or perceived safety, in the same way that survivors in the community may be able to do. The question then becomes, how does an acute crisis like sexual abuse interrupt a victim's ability to manage life in confinement? You know, what is their ability to then follow rules, get up and go to meals, participate in recreation, go to work, be near their perpetrator? You know, these constant reminders of a traumatic event can greatly impact how an offender reacts to the abuse. These daily tasks become all the more challenging, may even complicate or compound existing trauma, and may trigger the offender to behave in unpredictable ways. This unpredictability can create safety concerns for staff and other inmates if not appropriately addressed. And then we have to consider healthy development. For youth especially, the kinds and variety of life experiences that promote growth, self-discovery, and self-esteem are often really limited in a confinement setting. They often have a very limited ability to assert their own independence, take risks, and experiment sexually. These are all milestones that are critical to development, again, especially for youth. We also know that an inmate's ability to access outside support system is considerably limited while confined. Their ability to trust staff members within the facility may be limited as well. And when victims in confinement experience trauma, as a victim in the community would, opportunities for healing might be different or limited, which is one critical reason that facilitating support services with you all really becomes so important. And finally, control. People who are confined have very little control over their lives, choices, and environments. Sexual abuse strips incarcerated people of their power and control. And you know that when possible, it's important to give survivors of sexual abuse a sense of control. And Rebecca will talk very shortly about your role and how we can work together to restore a sense of control. Even if it's as simple as asking the inmate if they prefer to meet in the afternoon or the evening or the morning. So now that we understand a little bit more about the dynamics of sexual abuse and confinement, what do we do about it? PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act, gives us that roadmap. PREA was signed into law in 2003 after unanimous support from Congress and years of pressure from advocates and survivors. Congress at the time noted that the nation was largely unaware of the epidemic nature of prison rape and the day-to-day horror experienced by victimized inmates. But it wasn't until 2012 that standards, or our roadmap, was developed. We know that PREA extends far beyond the elimination of rape in prison. PREA really supports preventing, detecting, and responding to sexual abuse and sexual harassment in all confinement settings. We have standards for adult prisons and jails, lockups, juvenile facilities, and community confinement facilities. So again, if there's not a Department of Corrections facility in your community or your county, know that you may be called upon to support victims who might be in a juvenile facility, a halfway house, or a jail. PREA was really designed to protect public safety, ensure public health, and reduce institutional violence. I just want to briefly highlight some of the 43 standards, and at your leisure, if you're looking for good nighttime reading, you can certainly read all of them, but I just wanted to highlight some of those that may help to inform your work with incarcerated survivors. PREA designates strategies to help prevent sexual abuse, and if we can't prevent it, it provides us some strategies to help detect and respond to it right away. So naturally, we have to have a zero tolerance policy, which the Department of Corrections does. We have limits to cross-gender viewing and searching. Puts parameters around the way body searches can be conducted. There may be no cross-gender strip or body cavity searches, no cross-gender pat searches of female inmates or juveniles, nor can a transgender or intersex inmate be physically examined for the sole purpose of determining their sex. All staff must also make cross-gender announcing when entering inmates' housing units. DOC is unable to hire or promote anyone who's engaged in sexual abuse in a confinement setting or the community. We also perform background checks of all employees every 5 years. We talked a little bit earlier about folks who have limited English proficiency and their added vulnerability to sexual abuse. LEP inmates must have an equal opportunity to participate in or benefit from DOC's efforts to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse, which means that our education efforts are accessible to all. Supervisory staff conduct unannounced rounds to deter misconduct, both of staff and inmates. All victims are offered SANE exams at no cost and consistent with community levels of care. In order to help us better detect sexual abuse, we also provide comprehensive education for staff and inmates. All investigators of sexual abuse and sexual harassment receive additional specialized training, as do medical and mental health staff who work with inmates. PREA also requires the Department of Corrections identify inmates who have a potential high risk of sexual victimization and sexual abusiveness. We've implemented a screening tool to help us identify those at risk so that we can make better informed decisions about housing and programming. Staff, of course, have a duty to report all knowledge, information, and suspicion of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or report-related retaliation. Staff also have a responsibility to report any neglect, staff neglect, or violation of responsibilities. DOC also provides inmates with varied avenues to report incidents of sexual abuse and sexual harassment, and Rebecca's going to talk in a bit about specifically what those methods are. All allegations of sexual abuse and sexual harassment are administratively investigated by the department. DOC also refers all allegations that involve potentially criminal behavior to local law enforcement for criminal investigation. And at the close of every administrative investigation, inmates should receive notification of the investigation's outcome. The outcome may either be substantiated, unsubstantiated, or unfounded. And if the alleged perpetrator is a staff person, the victim must also be notified if the staff person is moved from the housing unit or the facility, or is indicted or convicted on a charge related to that allegation. Similarly, if the alleged perpetrator is another inmate, the victim must be notified if the inmate is indicted or convicted on a charge related to the allegation. Retaliation monitoring becomes really important. The department has zero tolerance for retaliation. As such, victim services coordinators within each facility is tasked with monitoring all people who report sexual abuse for retaliation for a period of no less than 90 days. All inmates, finally, who report a history of sexual abuse, whether in the community or confinement, must be offered follow-up with medical and mental health treatment when appropriate, and inmates who experience sexual abuse in confinement must receive timely and unimpeded access to emergency medical treatment and crisis intervention services. That includes access to emergency contraception, STI prophylaxis, and pregnancy tests. But there are two standards that are particularly important to advocates when working with victims of sexual abuse. And they are hospital accompaniment and confidential support services. During a SANE exam, inmates are permitted to have an advocate accompany and support them. This support may extend to any investigatory interviews. The standards also require that DOC provides inmate with access to outside services and advocates. At minimum, DOC must provide mailing addresses and telephone numbers for emotional support. And as you learned and will continue to learn, DOC has made it a practice to facilitate in-person meetings with advocates and inmates when it's appropriate. This standard, or these two standards, really motivate our time together today. And so if your agency hasn't yet had an opportunity to connect with a confinement facility in your county or your community, the question becomes, how do we begin bridging the gap between corrections and advocacy? Because sometimes that gap can feel really wide. My answer, our answer, is communication. First, it's really important to acknowledge and respect that we're coming from different worlds. Advocacy and confinement are often very different. The words to describe the two aren't similar at all, but I think we have both strengths to bring to the table. And once we're able to share those and communicate with each other, I think that we can bridge that gap that exists between the two. Advocates communicating with facilities and facilities communicating with advocates is really the only way to find solutions to the large and small barriers so that an inmate is best served. If you take anything from our time together today, I hope it's a reminder of the obvious, that collaborative, cooperative relationships are cultivated with communication. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. She's going to explore the different methods of advocacy and confinement and highlight the ways in which to ease your transition into facilities.
I would first like to start off by discussing a little bit about the racial disparity of imprisonment throughout the United States. As you can see from this graph presented by the Sentencing Project, approximately 3% of black males in the U.S. Were imprisoned as of December 31st, 2013, compared to 0.5% of white males. If you are a black male, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated during your lifetime, as compared to a 1 in 9 chance if you are a white male. You can see the statistics for other minority groups also increases your likelihood of confinement. In Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee conducted a study showing that incarceration rates of African Americans in Wisconsin were at 12.8% compared to the U.S. average of 6.7%. This rate is 3 points higher than the next highest state. The Prison Policy Initiative also noted that the black population in Wisconsin is approximately 6%, but make up approximately 38% of our prison and jail population. American Indians and Alaskan Natives make up about 1% of the Wisconsin population, but approximately 4% of our prison and jail population. And comparatively, whites make up 83% of Wisconsin's population, but are 52% of the incarcerated population. I think this is important information to have as you're providing advocacy. Leah had mentioned earlier some of the characteristics of those who are likely to be abused in prison, and when you're providing culturally competent services and advocacy, I think we need to continue to take a look at the populations that we are serving. I think there's some reasons behind this. Some of the prior sentencing practices of 3 strikes, mandatory sentencing policies, and things like that have contributed to these rates. I know the Department of Corrections' current focus is on evidence-based practices and initiating some trauma-informed work. So the hope is that these numbers will continue to decrease and we will see more clarity within the institutions and jail populations. But talking about advocacy in the institution, there's some guiding principles. I think it's important to note that no one, no matter what, ever deserves to be sexually abused. We need to keep that in mind. I receive a lot of questions about what about serving sex offenders, what about serving violent offenders, those types of things. Remember that providing advocacy does not mean that you approve of or agree with somebody's prior behaviors. It just means that you understand the importance of having emotional support to get through a traumatic incident. First and foremost, as an advocate, we need to remember that we always believe the victim. There are some challenges, obviously, to providing services within a confined setting, knowing that prisons and jails are culturally distinct environments. These are unfamiliar populations. You're probably not used to dealing with these sorts of individuals. Ensuring your own safety is always a concern. You're going to be working with people who may be or may even just appear to be dangerous, and those who have committed sex crimes. And you need to adapt your interventions and advocacy strategies for corrections environments. It's also difficult to expand your services with no new staff or funding. But the most important thing to remember is, as Leah pointed out previously, you already have the expertise and the skills needed to work with survivors. These are just survivors that are in a different environment. So first and foremost, it's important to remain open-minded. Inmates that you're working with know the stigma that they have. They know the jokes. They're familiar with how society views them. So they may attempt to tell you about their life before incarceration to try and get you to see that they're more than just their inmate number or their orange jumpsuit, and that's going to be important for them. You need to avoid discussing their prior criminal cases. A lot of times they may attempt to justify their behaviors or explain to you, their view of why they're in prison. Again, their incarceration and the reasons behind their incarceration is not important. What you are there for is to provide the advocacy. You need to demonstrate patience, consistent and persistent with them. It's going to take time to build trust with inmates. They're frequently used to seeing programs come and go from the institutions. They don't have, a lot of times, people who are stable in their lives, and they may try to test you and test the system to see if you are really going to stick around, if you're going to be there for the long haul with them. This might lead to them disclosing only small bits of information at a time just to see where you're at. The consistency is going to help build trust with them. They're going to test you to see if you're going to do what you say you're going to do. It may require you to be repetitive, retelling them things to ensure that they are believing what you're saying. Also, a lot of these inmates, in fact, a good majority of them, have a history of abuse that predates their incarceration, and they may have never have talked about this. When you come in as an advocate, that might be the first time, whether it be that they are a current victim of assault again in the institution, or if they just are wanting to discuss their prior victimization. This is very possibly the first time they've ever talked about it. Another concern of the survivor inmates is that they're probably not going to believe that the services that you're providing are actually going to be confidential. There is not a lot of privacy or confidentiality within the institutional setting, so that's another way that they're going to test things, is to ensure that the services that you are providing are confidential. It's going to be important for you to remind survivors that they're not alone. Incarceration in and of itself can make an individual feel alone and abandoned, and you need to let them know that you are there to support them emotionally. They may feel, again, that they deserve the abuse because of their incarceration, and this, too, can make them feel more alone. It's important, again, to communicate that they are not alone, that they are to be believed, and they are not to be blamed for what happened to them. Again, trusting your expertise. You already work with a diverse group of people in the community, and you will just take these skills and transfer them to the institution setting. The most important thing, again, for any survivor is to get support from someone who's trained to understand the impact of sexual abuse. The services that you're going to be providing are pretty much identical to those you're going to be providing in the community. It's going to be emotional support, crisis intervention, information and referral services. You will do a hospital accompaniment, accompany them to investigatory interviews or court accompaniment. You're going to assist them with preparing victim impact statements and other forms that they need. Again, these are very similar to the advocacy role that you provide in the community. However, inmates are likely to kind of ask you to do some things. There are going to be some challenging requests that they're going to ask. They have few resources. They're isolated. So they may ask for help with problems that are going to be unrelated to the sexual abuse. It's important that you don't ever agree to these requests, no matter how innocent they may seem. There may be court restrictions or institution policies that prevent certain behaviors, and you need to be firm and clear about your role and why you're there and what services you are there to offer. It's important to never take anything from an inmate at any point in time. Don't make calls on an inmate's behalf. You need to maintain your personal boundaries. Avoid physical contact other than possibly a handshake when you are first meeting with them, and avoiding any personal disclosures. Inmates can take and use things that you tell them to attempt to manipulate you, so you need to, again, remain firm and consistent about what your role there is. So when you accompany an individual who has been a victim to the hospital, again, as we have pointed out, the PREA standards do require that facilities offer inmates access to medical forensic exams and an advocate after sexual abuse. Advocates then are tasked with providing emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referral. There's going to be some differences when you're providing hospital accompaniment for a confined survivor versus a community survivor. Advocates and correctional staff or the law enforcement that may be present have different perspectives and different practices. So you need to be informed and open-minded about the correctional practices and work together to best serve the inmate. So in some ways, the advocacy is different, and some of those ways are that the survivor will possibly be in uniform or a jumpsuit type thing. They're probably going to be handcuffed, shackled, or restrained during the exam, or for at least parts of the exam. And also, correctional staff are going to be present in the room. This is for the safety of the inmate, the safety of the advocate, and the safety of any medical personnel who are working with the survivor. It's going to be best to talk to correction staff about how to meet the needs that you're there for the security of the survivor and to protect his or her dignity. When working with the inmate survivor, you need to inform them of their rights, and these are the same rights that any other survivor has. They have a right to have an advocate present during the examination and during any investigatory interviews. The inmate can decline the examination in its entirety or in its parts. You need to describe your role. Let the survivor, the inmate survivor, know what your role as an advocate is. It's very likely that they're not even going to understand why you're there. You're just one more person in the room. You need to help the survivor maintain their privacy and comfort, and help them work with the sane nurse to clarify questions that they may have. It's also important after the same exam to do your best to attempt to have a private or confidential meeting with the survivor if they would request one. This again can be kind of challenging in the environment, knowing that a correctional officer needs to maintain some sort of at least visual contact with the inmate survivor. So maybe if there's a room with a window, that might be a possibility. But again, talking to the correctional staff and the hospital staff to find the best way to do this. Sometimes it comes down to, sitting in the corner of a room, kind of away from people where you're still within sight, and just providing the inmate information about how to make follow-up contacts with you and what services you can offer. You're also going to be preparing the survivor for return to the facility. Most survivors who are incarcerated are going to return to the facility in which the assault occurred, even if it's only temporarily before they can be transferred. You need to work with them on what's going to happen next. Letting them know they are going to be transferred back to the facility. They may likely not return to their original housing unit. There is a possibility that they could be placed in protective custody until they can be transferred, or a more secure housing unit could be determined for them. Talk about the medical follow-up and what the medical staff has recommended for them. Let them know that they can connect with a victim services coordinator, or that they will be connected with a victim services coordinator within the institution. This is an individual who works within the Department of Corrections who's specially trained to handle PREA cases and work with the victims of sexual assault within the institution. Let them know that an investigation is going to ensue if the assault happened within the institution, and they have a right to participate in that investigation or not. And it's also important to talk with correctional staff to help the inmate understand what the next steps are and to work cooperatively to help meet the needs of the survivor. You're also going to want to discuss any concerns that the survivor might have about return to the facility. You're going to want to brainstorm options to address those concerns, developing a plan for their safety, for their security, and also offering a release of information to the victim so that you can continue to communicate after they are back in the institution about their safety, placement, and different things like that. The release of information is going to be important to have signed. Obviously, the dynamics of working within an institution are going to be different, and the victim is not going to be able to just come into your office at any point in time. So having that release of information so that you communicate with the victim services coordinator is especially important in these cases. You're also going to want to help them review some coping skills and find out what coping skills are most appropriate and effective in the setting that they're in. Every institution is a little bit different, and the inmate understands how the institution runs. They've probably developed some coping skills already, and expanding on those and making sure that they have the ability to have a successful return to the institution. You're also going to want to offer referrals and follow-up. You're going to want to discuss the follow-up care and support and what that's going to look like. Providing contact information to the offender about how to reach your agency. Make sure that you have permission from the correctional staff to give the inmate any information that you may be handing them. Remember to have that information also going to be accessible to people with cognitive disabilities, any visual impairments, any LEP concerns, or lower literacy levels. Again, you're going to want to explain to them what the victim services coordinator's role is, and if they're interested in face-to-face advocacy, how to set that up through the victim services coordinator. You're going to want to discuss the mental and medical health follow-ups that are available at the facility, and also working with the correctional staff on passing along any information that may be needed to get to the medical or mental health facility. Also, in addition to hospital accompaniment, the Department of Corrections has established a hotline which is free and unmonitored and unrecorded phone calls that come from the institution to your agencies. These calls may be different than the ones that you get from the community, but you need to treat them as you would any other hotline call, and make no assumptions when you find out that the call is from an inmate or an institution. One of the things that's going to be difficult, again, is for the inmate to believe that these calls are truly confidential. However, they are, and so you need to let them, assure them of that fact. Inmates, though, may test the system just to see if what they are saying is actually remaining confidential. When inmates make these calls, the regular procedures for the institution apply regarding the hours that they can use the phones, the lengths of calls, and things like that. The sexual assault service providers are adept at managing all types of circumstances and personalities. Again, that's going to be the same as when you're handling calls from the community. We would anticipate inmate calls to really be no different than this. However, it's going to be important to maintain firm boundaries with inmates. Again, they may ask for special requests. They may ask that the call be forwarded to a family member, a friend, an attorney. Again, these need to be denied, no matter what the circumstances or what stories you may be receiving. If you do get off-topic calls, you need to clarify the purpose of the hotline and what your role as an advocate is. It's going to be important for you to share ways in which an inmate can report sexual abuse if they are interested, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. If you do receive off-topic calls, those need to be redirected, and if you're unable to lead it back to the specific role of the call, it is perfectly acceptable for you to just terminate the call. During these hotline calls, a lot of the things you're going to work on are strategies to de-escalate any crisis that they may be in, sharing coping skills, providing information about referrals and resources. If you believe after talking to an inmate that they could benefit from an in-person visit with an advocate, you're going to want to encourage the inmate to contact the facility's victim services coordinator. So touring the institution and making the contacts, again, the communication with your local facility is going to be important because you're going to want to be able to provide the inmate with the knowledge about who that individual is at the facility that they're in. In addition to support from the crisis hotline, staff and advocates, all inmates that report sexual abuse do have access to support services from inside the institution. There are medical and mental health clinicians available for them to work with on a long-term basis. And if there are any long-term interventions that are needed that's beyond just immediate crisis intervention, that's where the inmate should be directed to receive services from. These calls are monitored by the technicians working with the DOC. They regularly test the outgoing calls to the agencies to make sure that the line is working properly. Again, when you're working, because this is a new program that has recently been developed, it's going to be important for when you're training new advocates within your agency to make sure that they are informed about the prison rape survivor needs and incorporating the advocate hotline training into your training for advocates. So ways to report, there are several ways to do that, and those are listed on the screen. The inmates do have an internal reporting hotline by just picking up the phone and dialing 777. They can report to an external agency, again, by just dialing 888. They can tell any staff person within the institution. If they would tell a family member, friend, or support system, that person could report to the DOC or to the PREA office. They can file a formal complaint, or they could contact their local law enforcement agency. Staff within the DOC has to accept the reports verbally and writing anonymously and from any third parties. If an outside person, a family member or friend, receives or is knowledgeable about a sexual assault that has occurred in the institution, reports can also be filed on behalf of an inmate online at the Department of Corrections PREA website. It's important to keep in mind that when inmates are calling the hotline, they're calling the hotline to get support. If the choice is to report, these would be the ways that you would direct them to be able to do so. However, frequently inmates are just looking simply for the support versus having to report it. They may be well aware that reporting the assault is going to immediately lead to to an investigation due to the Department of Corrections zero tolerance policy. And for reasons that Leah has discussed previously, they may not want to be involved in an investigatory process. Okay, and written correspondence. You may be receiving letters from inmates at the institution. What you're going to want to do most likely is provide a consistent, somewhat generic response. That's just going to give the inmates information about sexual assault resources. You're going to want to give them information on the hotline, that they can make calls to the hotline, and explain the basic procedures for if they would choose to have in-person contact, how that would look, again, by going through the Victim Services Coordinator. Generally, written correspondence within the institution is not monitored. However, it is not completely confidential. Security director at an institution can approve incoming mail to be monitored if there is a safety concern for the institution. And in those instances, the mail is usually not read. However, it is checked for contraband in the inmate's presence. So although the mail is not specifically read, again, it's not completely confidential. The only true completely confidential method of communication is the hotline. When responding, it's best to use simple, clear language. Use a respectful tone. You're going to have varying education levels within the institution. Average approximately a 6th grade reading level of individuals who are incarcerated. You're going to want to personalize the response so that it's not, even though I said a generic response, putting the inmates, Mr. Johnson, as the, heading for the letter is going to go a long way towards letting them know that you are really paying attention. One thing to keep in mind is that in all correspondence, an inmate number needs to be used. It's a 6-digit number. When you receive a letter from an institution, that number will be on there, so you will have access to that when you're responding. Remember that a few kind words can go a long way towards establishing trust. So if you're going to do a more personalized response, keeping it professional, but also, letting them know that you are there, you do care, you validate their feelings, that's going to really help open them up and maybe allow them to receive further services. A lot of times these letters are simply looking for basic rape crisis services, and in those instances it's fine to just send more of a generic response. So when you're actually reporting to the institution to do in-person services, you have to remember it's natural to feel nervous, a little afraid. It is, again, a unique environment that most of us have not been exposed to in the past. And most importantly, though, keep in mind that correctional officers and correctional staff are there to keep you safe. So if at any point in time you're ever feeling threatened, unsafe, feeling just uncomfortable, just check in with the nearest staff person and they will assist you in ensuring your safety. While in the institution, you need to be observant and aware of your surroundings. If you see something that's suspicious or unusual, you need to report that to the correctional staff. Even though the institutions are making efforts to make sure that the areas where that you meet are obviously safe and monitored in the best way that they can, you're going to want to make sure that you're examining the space for an escape route. Make sure that you're sitting in an area where you have access to being able to get out. Talk to correctional staff about what you need to do should an emergency arise while you're meeting with an individual. It's important to remain professional. It's important, of course, to be respectful, compassionate, and consistent, but using safe and effective communication to clearly express your expectations, directions, and intentions. You need to remain mindful of nonverbal communication. So if an inmate starts to act what seems in an unusual way or something that makes you suspicious, again, Your safety is paramount. When you're talking to inmates, it is suggested that you refer to them by Mr. or Miss and their last name, and inmates are required to address a professional visitor, which would be you, in the same manner. You're going to want to maintain consistent, fair, and firm boundaries. Again, physical contact other than a handshake is not allowed. So you're not allowed to, even if somebody is upset, don't be holding hands, holding their hand, trying to comfort them, giving hugs, anything like that. It's going to be important to be effective at saying no. Again, inmates may ask for things that are outside the scope of your duties and test the boundaries. Remember to never take anything into or out of the facility on behalf of an inmate. If you ever have questions about what is allowed, ask staff for guidance. There are restrictions even on providing, advocacy materials or materials about your agency. Make sure that those things are cleared with the Victim Services Coordinator prior to actually giving them to the inmate. While in the institution, again, be aware of your emotional space. You're going to want to avoid personal disclosures, and including when you're trying to use these as a kind of a teaching tool or to illustrate a point. The less information an inmate has about you personally, the safer you're going to be. Obtaining the rules about the institution and what's allowed and what's not allowed. Take that direction from the staff rather than the inmates. And even if the staff tells you a rule and it might seem overly restrictive, you need to respect the rules and the policies of the institution. You need to understand that privacy for an inmate is very limited. If an inmate decides they do not want to talk about a topic, don't probe on that. Respect their right to privacy, and those issues may come up at a different time. But because of the environment that they're in, they're subject to cell searches, they have people around them all the time. You need to, keep that in mind, that privacy and confidentiality are very limited within an institution. It's important to avoid using the us versus them in conversations. Inmates are going to have a very different view of how the institution is run than what correctional staff does. It's easy to believe the grapevine that inmates may tell you stories about how things are run in the institution. They may blame staff about things that have occurred or things that have happened. At this point, just remind inmates that they do have a formal complaint process. And even if they say that doesn't do any good, keep encouraging that, because changes in policies have been made as a result of the proper use of this system. When you're reporting to the institution, seek support and help from your colleagues, from your supervisors, or even from the Victim Services Coordinator of the institution. Because this is a kind of a new ground, new territory that all of us are dipping into, we need to accept that we're going to be uncomfortable, we're going to be nervous, and we're going to have questions. And never assume that there's anything too minor to report or to receive guidance on. Accept that your feelings of nervousness are normal, and process those feelings beforehand and debrief them afterwards if necessary with your colleagues. But most importantly, it's important to be non-judgmental, non-blaming, and non-shaming. So when you're working, again, with the victim, inmate victim, it is important to build rapport to them. Again, avoid asking them about their crime that they've been convicted of. Meet survivors where they're at. You need to understand that intimidating behavior is likely a natural response to trauma, and it just may feel a little bit different because of the environment that you're in. So you need to show survivors that you're committed to them. Be patient, build trust with them. Generally, inmates are very grateful to see that there is somebody from the outside who is willing to come in and help them, and they're unlikely to do anything to compromise those services. Again, you need to clarify your role. Inmates are going to have high expectations of you, so make sure that you're clear about why you're there and what your role as an advocate is, which is, again, to foster hope and resiliency. Can't stress enough the confidentiality issues, that there are limits to that within an institution, and you need to make the inmate aware of what those limits are, even with your discussions with them. There is going to have to be communication between yourself and the victim services coordinator, even to make the appointment to set up the appointment to see them. So although you're not going to go discussing what's talked about during your meetings with them, they need to understand that there are some limits to those types of things. Also keep in mind that they always can be referred to facility-based medical and mental health services. There are chaplains available, social workers, and those are always options for ongoing care. It's also important to make a plan for follow-up in the community if the release date is nearing. An inmate may transfer to a different institution. If you know where the inmate is going, provide referral information for the local staff at whatever institution they're going to. Remember that each session that you have with an inmate could be your last session. That could be due to either their release, their transfer, and other considerations that happen within the institution. So making sure that they have a plan for what they can do if you specifically are no longer available is important. So when providing the advocacy, it's important to adapt your interventions to fit the correctional environment that you're in. Many offenders may feel that they deserve abuse because of their incarceration, again, making them feel even more alone. Because of the highest expectations that survivors may have of you, you need to be clear about the role and realize that many aspects of daily life within the institution can be triggers. The lights, the noises, the sounds, they may be seeing their perpetrator on a daily basis or a frequent basis. Those things obviously are all triggers, and that can be stressful for any survivor, much less an inmate survivor. They do face potential re-traumatization at every turn, so you need to recognize what the triggers are and what the practical limits to their coping skills are going to be. Normally, the best thing to guide them on is self-contained coping skills, which would include things like meditation, grounding, reading, if they have, rec time, going for walks, different things like that. Writing can sometimes be something that's suggested. However, they have to understand that anything that they write does run the risk of having, possibly a staff member or another inmate finding whatever they're writing. When you're meeting with them, realize that after your meeting, they're most likely to be returned directly to the unit. So make sure you give a little bit of time at the end of your session for them to regroup and kind of compose themselves prior to going back to their unit. You're going to want to develop a safety plan with them, assessing what are the threats to their safety. Is that threat from an inmate? Is it from a staff person? Is it from both? And reviewing what action that they have already taken to stay safe. Who can they reach out to? Where would they go to feel safe? When you are prior to going to the institution, you also have to be prepared. There could be a disruption to services. The institution could possibly be in lockdown. So before you go here, we're going to want to contact the institution or the victim services coordinator to ensure that the facility is accepting visitors prior to traveling, and that the inmate is actually still there. Again, remembering that every time you meet with an inmate, it could be the last time you meet with them. So you're going to want to stress the development of self-care plans, and you're going to want to do that kind of instantly so that they have the skills necessarily, even if for some reason they would be no longer able to work with you. You may encounter inmates who have suicidal ideation. You're going to want to determine in advance how these are going to be handled. And keep in mind that frequently within an institution or a jail setting, suicide watch can often mean put in segregation or, a solitary confinement type setting. Again, you're going to want to follow up or provide them follow-up information for what they can do in the community. Maybe they're only going to meet with you a few times, and maybe they even meet with their social worker or victim services coordinator throughout their stay at the institution. But you're going to want to make sure that they have the information about the agency in their local community, so if they need continued services upon their release from the institution, that they have that capability. So there are some rules that these are somewhat developed by the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. However, I think they're pretty standard rules for reporting to any confined setting, whether it be a jail, a correctional facility, or a halfway house, that type of thing. You're going to want to remember to dress professionally and conservatively. The facility that you're going to could give you a list of any attire that would not be permitted. You're not going to want to wear excessive jewelry or clothing with metal that's attached to it, such as large buckles, snaps, buttons, underwire bras, things like that. Those can trigger metal detectors and require a special inspection. Shoes that you wear should be closed-toed. Heels should be 3 inches or less, and the width must be reasonable. So basically, no, spiked heels, stilettos, those types of things. You're probably going to be walking some distance while at the institution, so you're going to want to make sure that you're wearing comfortable shoes. Don't bring in things such as cameras, cell phones, pagers, electronic equipment. Don't bring wallets, credit cards, or cash, and no smoking materials. Security staff is going to inspect anything that you do bring into the facility, and you'll be provided a locker or some sort of other area to keep your personal belongings. To get into the institution, you're going to want to schedule those meetings with the facility's victim services coordinator, and you're going to want to contact the victim services coordinator on the day of the visit, again, to make sure that the operations of the institution are running smoothly and that you are going to be able to meet with the inmate survivor. Prior to going, you're going to need to have a criminal background check done, so it's not like you can call the victim services coordinator and say, I'm planning on coming this afternoon to meet with this inmate. So you're going to need to plan these things out in advance. You're going to be required to provide a valid photo identification, most likely sign in. You're probably going to be wearing a visitor's badge and have your hands stamped that will be checked upon you're leaving the institution. At some facilities, you may also be given a personal alarm in case of an emergency situation. You're going to be required to pass through and clear a metal detector, and if you have concerns about that, you need to discuss that with security staff in advance. In most instances, you will be escorted by facility staff or victim services coordinator to get you to the location where you're going to be meeting with the survivor. However, there are institutions or jail settings which might allow you to move about more freely and without an escort. With any questions that you have, you should ask, obviously. Keep in contact with the institution and the victim services coordinator. Again, even bringing what seems like helpful information into the institution, such as brochures about sexual assault or the services that you provide. Make sure all of those things are cleared with correctional staff prior to giving them to the institution. Make sure that anything that you are providing is free of staples, fasteners, paper clips, those types of things. It's important, especially important, to tour your local institutions or jail settings. I think that's really going to help you familiarize yourself with the setting and help you be a little bit less nervous and kind of decrease the anxiety that you're feeling. It's also could be helpful to participate in the volunteer orientation if your institution offers one. However, due to PREA guidelines and volunteers falling under mandatory reporting for PREA, it's recommended that you do not actually become a volunteer so that you can maintain the role as the advocate and the confidential communication. Now, we were going to show another video clip. Joe, it's called My Name is Joe, and Joe Booth is a survivor of prison rape. However, looking at the time, we have run into some time constraints, and I still want to leave time for questions if there are any. And so we're going to, since that was included for you within your email that Peter sent out yesterday, we're just going to give you the opportunity to view that on your own. Basically, Joe is a survivor of prison rape, and he talks about the importance of advocacy and how the advocate really kind of helped support him, and it was kind of his lifeline after his assault. Just giving you a few resources that are available. The PREA Resource Center, their Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault has a tools for advocates working with incarcerated victims, which is just kind of a general guideline. A lot of the information we talked about today is in there. The Department of Corrections has information about sexual assault service providers visiting basics, again reviewing some of the information we talked about today to just give it to you kind of in a clearer format. And Just Detention International, I find them to be a fabulous resource. They have all kinds of videos and resources, and most specifically, they have a wonderful sexual assault in detention advocacy handbook that they have created. Up on the screen, you can see both mine and Leah's contact information. Again, I work for the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and Leah is with the Wisconsin Department of Corrections in the PREA office. So please reach out to either of us by phone or email.
On behalf of Rebecca, we both really appreciate your participation. Thank you for bearing with us, giving us an extra 5 minutes. It's really been a pleasure to connect with you today. We look forward to, again, a continued conversation about these issues. If there are any issues that arise as you attempt to enter a facility, please, again, do reach out to us. We really hope to be your advocates. So thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.